want to start by asking each of you to briefly share your story, how you became so deeply immersed in genealogy research and its impact on your life. Danny, I want to start with you, please.
So in 2016, on the suggestion of my husband, for purely recreational reasons, I spit into a plastic vial and sent my home DNA test off to be evaluated. I wasn't doing this for any reason. I didn't imagine I would learn anything new. I knew that I was 100% Eastern European Ashkenazi, Jewish on both of my parents' sides, going back for as many generations as we could count. And when the results came back, they told a very different story, and a story that really changed my life. They initially showed me that I was only about 50% Eastern European Ashkenazi. And in fairly short order, I came to understand that my beloved dad, who raised me and who died when I was 23, had not been my biological father. And that began a deep dive, I should also say, after having written 9 books that all really had to do in some way or another with secrecy. I came to realize that I had been the secret in my family and between my parents, and that they had been going through fertility treatments in the early 1960s when I was conceived, and that ultimately donor sperm had been used and that I was donor conceived. That was something that at the time was considered completely not something that parents would ever talk about. And so my identity, my genetic identity, was not something that I knew, and not something I ever would have known without recreational DNA testing. And the dive that I went into ultimately in my book Inheritance and in the journey that I've been on ever since is really what makes a family, what makes a father, what is nature, what is nurture. I feel like ultimately all my life has sort of led to this. I'm like a thought experiment in those very questions. And that's what I've been researching and thinking about and writing about ever since.
Oh, such a compelling story. And Jennifer, you were actually directly involved in Danny's search. So tell us how you got into this field and your connection with her story.
Well, I like to say I got into this completely accidentally. I had a long career as a magazine and newspaper journalist. I had zero interest in genealogy. My brother Daniel actually was the genealogist in the family, and some people in the audience might be familiar. He wrote a book in 2007 called The Lost, in which he went back and found out what happened to all of our family in Eastern Europe. And it was his passion and his thing, and I just didn't get involved. A completely accidental Google search in 2013 led me down the rabbit hole of genealogy. I landed on the census, which I had never seen before, and all of a sudden I realized that genealogy was actually the perfect distillation for all the things I loved, even though I had never known it. It was storytelling and puzzle solving and reporting, and I just fell hard and fast. And I always joke that I probably would not be sitting here today if not for the fact that my first at-bat, I sort of accidentally, once again, hit the equivalent of a Grand Slam home run. I sort of naively embarked on this journey to find family for my husband's 95-year-old grandmother, who was a Holocaust survivor. And we learned that she had living first cousins that nobody knew about, and I reunited them. And then I was really hooked. How I got to Danny was I just got deeper and deeper and deeper into this world. I realized I had a knack for it. My background as a journalist was really sort of a perfect fit to be a good genealogist. And Danny and her husband knew we were acquaintances. They knew that I was involved in this world. And when she got these disconcerting DNA results, they called me. And in the course of what I like to describe as a very charged 45 minutes on speakerphone, at the end, we were staring at a photograph of the face of Danny's biological father, which was pretty intense.
Wow. Okay. And Libby, your book also includes some pretty compelling personal stories, as well as some deep reporting on how the field has changed and the thorny issues that are raised by these questions. How did you first get interested in the topic, and why has it become so complex?
Yeah. So, I mean, I was really interested in this idea that a technology that had been created for, recreational purposes, billed as entertainment, advertised around Thanksgiving, get this gift for your aunt, for your dad, et cetera, that it was actually reshaping people's lives. And I was interested in how that happens on a micro level. So for the individual and her sense of identity, as Danny has spoken about and written movingly about. And then within a family, right, the dynamics of a conversation with your mother, the dynamics of a conversation with or a getting to know your half sibling you didn't know existed. And then I think on a macro level, across the culture at large, because what we're really doing now is opening a box that was previously a black box, right? For all of history, we never had the ability to know our true genetic identities. We accepted the stories that we were told. We fashioned our identities out of them. And most of the time, unless somebody, came along and told us otherwise, that was what we understood our truths to be. And now we're in this kind of unprecedented era. This moment when you can test because you're just kind of curious about your pie chart, and you find out really something that's fundamentally upending and moving and profound about your identity and how you came to be. And so I started sort of interviewing people because I was really interested in these experiences. And I wanted to locate the central narrative of my book in one particular story. And that was the story of a woman named Alice who tested 8 years ago, which is not a very long time ago, but within the realm of this world, it's an extremely long time ago because there's been so many advances and so many more people have tested. And this woman, Alice, believed herself to be entirely Irish American, and in fact discovered that she was half Ashkenazi Jewish. And her journey to understand that was kind of twofold, I would say. I mean, one was the understanding of how this could be, how her family got its identity wrong, how she, who she really was, and the surprise, because for her, it was not any of the more common explanations. It was not the case that she wasn't genetically related to her dad, that she was donor conceived, that she was adopted, although she explored all those theories. And so part of it was the process of getting to a place of understanding of the kind of logistics of her situation and her own history. But it was also an existential reckoning, right? What does it mean to be Jewish and not have known it? How much does your biology get to inform you about your identity? How much does the past get to tell you about who you are, and how much choice do we have in that? And how do we reconcile that with experience? And Alice kind of, wrestled with all those things along with the hundreds of people that I've talked to. And I think, for this moment that we're in, these are absolutely essential questions that we all need to be talking about and wrestling with.
So let me follow up with you for a second, because it used to be that, when you heard about genealogy buffs, you were talking about people who, wanted to develop those family trees and dig deep a little into their ancestry. But obviously, as you just mentioned, there's so much more now trying to just, technologically delve in. So explain to us kind of the scope of what's out there and how many Americans are actually engaging in this activity.
Yeah, absolutely. So the field of recreational DNA testing, which is the kind of DNA testing we're talking about, testing to discover your ancestry, in contrast to, say, testing through your doctor's office to find out if you're at high risk of a particular disease, that world is exactly 20 years old now. But the beginnings of the kind of DNA that we're talking about really harken back to about a decade ago. So autosomal DNA, which can tell you about, it gives you that, your maternal and your paternal relatives, so you're getting your immediate kin and you're getting that ethnicity estimate pie chart. That really only came on the scene about a decade ago. And the man who sort of started recreational DNA testing for ancestry purposes is a genealogist. He founded the first company in the US in Texas. And he thought he was answering a simple question for himself, a kind of a devout genealogist. He thought this product was going to exist just for other genealogists. And he was so wrong, because what happened is that it became a casual consumer item. It became something that Ancestry and 23andMe and MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA, but particularly Ancestry, put a lot of advertising dollars into. And this became the thing that you purchase for yourself just for fun, for entertainment, to get that pie chart. This became the thing that you get as a gift for the person in your life who already has everything. So I started looking into this topic and writing about it 3 years ago. At the time, there were 8 million people spread across the 4 major databases. 2 years later, there were 30 million. Now there are 35 million. And the vast majority of those are Americans. Because of that, there's somewhere about 7 to 8% of the US population has tested, which means that even if you never choose to test, you already have relatives in the system. And because of the nature of shared genetic material, we're all sort of affected by this technology. We've entered an era when family secrets are no longer family secrets. They're being exploded because people are engaging this technology. And also people are being given the gift of understanding themselves and understanding how the past, which we think of as over, isn't really over, right? It continues to shape us now. It's just that we never had access to it before. And now we have this incredible access.
Wow. Danny, you gave kind of the outlines of your story, and we don't want to give away too much of your book, but at the same time, I think the relationship and first of all, the way Jennifer said, within 45 minutes, you found your biological father, which is probably, rare. That is quite so quick. I'm sure you're really good, Jennifer, but still, I'm sure that's a little rare that you find somebody so quickly. What has that meant? And tell us a little bit about how you got in touch with him and what the reaction was, because of course that's one of the big issues that gets raised, right? Like, how does somebody who donated their sperm as, a medical student, suddenly confront this child that they were involved with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing that I would say is that because I was in a certain level of shock and distress at this brand new information that kind of really upended my sense of everything that I had always known, I immediately launched into this research mode. My husband and I both did, and we got pretty far down the road. And then Jennifer, closed, she closed the deal. There was such a sense that I had of, because I had never known, and what I realized was that it meant that I had a biological father out there who I had never known existed. I was, in this intense state of distress and need to find out everything that I could as quickly as I could. And so when we did have this very rapid, domino effect, which was extraordinary and is unusual, but also, as Libby said, because there are so many people in the system now, there's kind of no hiding, and there's just because someone hasn't taken the test doesn't mean that they're not findable. In the case of my biological father, a nephew of his had, and he showed up as a relative on my page, and that and a few other hunches, we were able to zero in on him. At the moment that we did, imagine I went from being 54 years old, thinking that my beloved dad, who died when I was 23, had been gone all of these years. That was true. My mother was also gone. And then suddenly I am looking at a YouTube video of a man who is kind of unmistakably my biological father, and he's living, and he's 78 years old, and he's a retired physician, and he's giving a lecture, actually, on medical ethics, because you really can't make this stuff up. And I recognize him, not as in like, that's my father, but that's who I come from. He was gesturing with his hands. I write about this in my book. He was gesturing with his hands as he was giving this lecture. And that's what I recognized. I saw that he was gesturing the same way that I do when I'm behind a lectern giving a lecture. And there was not a single moment where I wondered or questioned whether I should reach out to him. I just did. And Jennifer actually suggested to me that I might want to slow down, that there are templates for these things, and that maybe I wanted to take a beat. And I remember thinking, if there's one thing I know how to do, I'm a writer, and I also, I know how to empathically put myself in someone else's shoes. And I think I ended up getting it right when I reached out to him, because I thought to myself, what would it be to be a 78-year-old retired physician opening your email one morning, and in the midst of all the other, emails about, political campaigns and golf dues, what you're seeing is, hi, I think you're my biological father. So I tread very carefully. I understood that his privacy was at stake. I let him know that I meant him no, I wanted nothing. One thing I will say is that I think a lot of the people who are on the receiving end of these calls, the people who donated as young people, and now they're, they've lived a whole life and now they're contending with this, often feel very threatened when someone reaches out of nowhere, seemingly saying, I think you're my biological parent. It is a primal feeling to just feel threatened, like, what do you want from me? And I wanted to let him know I didn't want anything from him other than perhaps validation that this was true, that I was correct, and also perhaps medical history, because I had been giving incorrect medical history all my life, both for myself and for my son.
Mm. Jennifer, why did you caution, that maybe she was going too fast? I mean, you have a lot of experience with lots of different people, and I'm sure you've seen, the pros and the cons, and that some of these, stories turn out really beautifully. And I'm sure there's a lot of heartbreak in a lot of these stories as well. What have you learned with your experience about the way to do this?
Well, there is no one size fits all way. I have quite literally seen everything along the spectrum, from warm and gushy, loving reunions to cease and desist letters. There is no one way that this sort of revelation unfolds. There's always a bit of a calculated risk about how and who you make the first approach to, because sometimes it's not directly to the person that you're seeking, it's to someone along the way. But if you gamble wrong and address the wrong person, you may lose ultimately your contact with the person that you're seeking. Some of these stories can be unbelievably thorny in ways that you cannot even imagine. And it all ended up okay for Danny in the end. So my caution notwithstanding.
Right. But this just raises so many, ethical issues. I mean, the sperm donor from, his earlier life. I mean, what are the privacy issues? Like, what's going on right now in terms of addressing some of these?
I'll just add one thing, though, as you were talking about Danny was talking about the sort of, what do you want approach. I can say without question, I get that just in making genealogical approaches to people, having nothing to do with DNA surprises or, hi, I'm your third cousin, I tracked you down. And some people are like, calling in the National Guard. Like, I just think people are very protective of the family that they know. And a new person on the scene suddenly shifting that landscape feels very threatening to some people, even though you want nothing but like, great grandma Sophie's kugel recipe. It's like, people just are very frightened of that. As of privacy issues, I think Libby might actually be the one to address that.
Yeah, I mean, this question of how do you make the call is something that I think individual consumers certainly are not prepared. They're not necessarily expecting to have to make, right? So in the kind of realm of medical testing, if you decide to test to find out if you're at risk of early onset Alzheimer's or at risk of, elevated risk of breast cancer, for instance, you're going to take a test and then a genetic counselor is going to sit down with you and hold your hand and explain what this elevated risk means, right? And this complex interplay with the environment and not smoking and exercising and all of that. And you're going to walk away with somewhat of a clear sense, right? That you have a sense of what's going on. In the context of the medical world, they have a kind of a guidelines for what's known as incidental findings. When you test to find out one thing and you find out another, do you inform the patient? Within the world of recreational DNA testing, there are no bioethicists. The consumer, she or he, they are their own bioethicists. Jennifer and I did a talk in Baltimore just before the pandemic really hit. I was actually able to go to Baltimore and we did a book event, and there was a woman in the audience who raised her hand and she had tears in her eyes. And she said, if I recall, she said that she had been doing DNA testing with her family and she had discovered that her brother was not the biological father of her niece. And she did not know what she was supposed to do with that information. Should she inform them? How was this now her burden to carry? You see that over and over again, the situations where someone tests and they discover that their mother was donor conceived. And now they have to make the decision about whether to inform their mother. And there's not much in the way of guidance, right? The guidance comes from people like Jennifer, someone you're working with, a search angel, a genetic genealogist. The companies themselves will have sort of like pages up that might say, we're going to help you. This is a little bit of guidance about navigating unexpected relationships. And they might direct you to talk to a mental health professional. But it is this totally unforeseen consequence of a consumer technology that has this kind of facet to it that really nobody expected, and I think it has these ripple effects. So I interviewed a woman who, for instance, discovers she's adopted through DNA testing, age of 51. Nobody told her. Her adopted mother didn't tell her, even when she knew she was doing DNA testing. And when she makes this discovery, she finds her way to her maternal half siblings. And her mother has just died 6 months before. So she's in this place of real sort of frustration and loss. There are questions she can never ask of her biological mother. Like, did you look for me? Did you think of me? Because the woman's children were never told that the mother had given away a child. And they were not aware of this woman at all. When she comes in and she introduces herself, she says, I am your older half sister that our shared mother gave away for adoption many years ago. She is essentially being made the messenger of her own existence. And that saying, don't shoot the messenger. When you bring someone news that is difficult, sometimes the instinct is, as Danny said, and as Jennifer was saying, to feel threatened, to sort of say, hey, get away from me. What are you doing in my space? The response of the daughters in this situation is to say, how dare you sully the memory of the mother that we had and we loved and we just lost, right? And what you see there is the kind of collision of genetic reality with sacred narratives. We all have these kind of truths about our families and the people that we love. And so, if some person's existence actually threatens your understanding of your mother's love, your reaction may be to say, no, thank you. I don't believe this, stop trying to contact me. And there are also incredibly moving stories of like people coming together and being embraced, but you simply don't know what you're going to find.
So look, you're all raising really important questions about answers that people are looking for, relatives, but also kind of the subtext of, what's the inherent, potential pitfalls and trauma that can evolve from this. Danny, if you had to do this, if you knew what you know now and were going to do it again, would you do it again?
Yeah, I would. Even though it was initially so shocking and so kind of destabilizing, it was also the truth. And, I have this podcast called Family Secrets, in which I explore with my guests in every episode, discovering a particular family secret. And at the end of every episode, I ask my guest, do you wish you hadn't known? And no one ever says, yes, I wish I hadn't known, because I think there's some way in which when something is being kept from us, we feel it, we intuit it, we can't put our finger on it. I spent my life knowing that there was something that didn't quite make sense, that it just didn't add up. I didn't add up. I was very moved by what Libby said about sort of being the messenger of our own existence. I felt somehow like there was something a little blurry about me. It was not in sharp relief. And I didn't understand that because I came from this prominent Orthodox Jewish family. And I, was like the epitome of Jewish belonging. And yet somehow I just didn't feel like I fit in my family. And so when I made my discovery and have learned everything that I've learned since then, what I've ended up feeling is actually a pretty profound liberation, because what was true really just came to light, and I was able to see it with a kind of clarity and understand so much about my own history and my own present. And I also feel very fortunate because I was just at a point in my life where I was able to make this discovery and be able to process it and learn a lot about it. I mean, Jennifer, I know, has spoken with and has helped elderly people who make discoveries. Like the whole question is, what we find out and when we find it out. There would have been a too young for me, and there may have been a too old as well. I mean, when I started researching almost immediately after my discovery, it was because I felt like there was still a lot that I could learn. There were still people living who might know something. I could piece together the puzzle. And that was really important to me to try to do that.
Can I just say, I think the gift of Danny's discovery and so many other people who are discovering themselves right now, and I echo what she says about the value of the truth and people saying, I don't regret it, I wouldn't unknow it if I could, is not that we suddenly substitute our biological identity for everything that came before. There's this great DNA testing ad where the guy, it's about a guy named Kyle, who by now is famous. And he said, you've met, and Jennifer's met him, of course. He says he tested, he thought he was one thing, he turned out to be another. He says, I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt. And first he's wearing lederhosen, and then you see him and he's wearing a kilt. And, the ad is so kind of flat in its suggestion that ethnicity is something that is a clothing, a costume that you can take off and put on. But I have found, and certainly I think, Danny writes movingly about this in her book, we are much more nuanced, we human beings, than any, marketing ad could make us out to be. And I found over and over that it was not as if people were saying, well, so long, Dad, now that you're not my bio dad, I'm just going to go over and hang out with this guy over here, right? It's not as if we don't have the capacity in the human heart to include, this idea of two different fathers, right? The man who gave us our genetic inheritance and the man who shaped us through every day and every night and singing to us, when we went to sleep. It's that we don't have the language for it. We don't yet have the words sometimes to describe those relationships, which is maybe just a flaw in the lexicon. And I think one that maybe will be remedied in coming years, because there's so many people who, there's millions of Americans right now in situations where they or someone they know is discovering some really important thing about themselves, and it's reconfiguring the family, and it's forcing these sometimes difficult conversations, very important conversations. As this happens to more and more people, I think we're going to have to develop a way of speaking about these relationships in a way that is inclusive and expansive and reflects our ability to embrace both the biological reality of how we're formed, but also, everything else that's so incredibly important that shapes us.
I think we'd be remiss in this context specifically not to talk about the discovery or the lack of Jewishness that sometimes arises from these tests, which can be incredibly complicated. Somebody like Danny, who comes from a strict Orthodox family, discovers that is only half of her actual, family tree. We have people all the time who discover through DNA tests that they have Jewish heritage, but they are not practicing Jews or have no familiarity with Judaism, and that can be shocking. The other thing I wanted to mention, which dovetails with that, is that when Libby said earlier that, there's no guidebook, there's no, genetic counselor holding her hand, one thing that is sort of a wonderful byproduct of this experience is that there are tons and tons of, for lack of a better word, user-generated support groups. There's a million Facebook groups. There's, websites. There's places people. This experience is becoming so common that there are many places where people are communing. And what made me think of it is there is a group on Facebook just for people who have had surprise discoveries of Jewish DNA, a group just of people with that particular finding, to sort of talk about what this means. And, there's Stephen Foster, who's in the Hadassah article, he's learning to make cholent, and he lives in Kentucky and had never met a Jewish person in his whole life. And now he's making cholent. Like, it's definitely a piece of all of this, and complicated. I don't have the answer for whether that makes you Jewish or not. In our Jewish DNA group, we have a very strict rule: no discussions of who is a Jew. If you want to have that conversation, talk to a clergy person. But these questions are out there for sure.
So interesting. And you actually wrote once that Jewish DNA is different from other DNA. What did you mean by that, and why is that so? This could be an hour-long talk in and of itself. I'll try to give you the Cliff's Notes version. Eastern European Jews are, for genetic purposes, what is known as an endogamous community. It basically means that because of our tradition of only marrying within the community, meaning for centuries, Jews only married other Jews, because of the way that affects our genetic inheritance, we basically are, one easy way to think about it is we're sort of, many of us, all distantly related. And that makes it very difficult when you get your DNA results to determine, it looks like you are related to a lot of people to whom you are really not meaningfully related. And when somebody is trying to use their DNA results to identify an unknown parent or grandparent, it can be much, much harder to do that when you are working with Jewish DNA, because everybody on paper sort of looks like a cousin. And that can be very difficult if you don't know what you're doing. Oh. Several questions have actually come through related to, somebody coming from Poland or losing relatives in the Holocaust. And I know you have some experience with that also, Jennifer, of reuniting some people, but I'm sure that's a particularly difficult search, right? To try to figure out which relatives might have been, lost, or if there are any around that nobody knows about.
Well, it definitely happens. You can use DNA. I know of many examples of people who have DNA tested and discovered through a match to someone. Maybe we should just take a quick second and say a lot of people only know about DNA testing, the pie chart. That's what they think you get when you take a DNA test. But I just want to make clear that the other very important piece of this, which sort of undergirds, Danny's whole story, is that you get a list of people with whom you share DNA ranked in order of closeness to you. So, in Danny's case, she was showing a first cousin and she had no idea who this person was because she thought she knew all her first cousins. And those are the discoveries that can be very, very shocking and upsetting when you see these people. But in many cases, they are wonderful discoveries because you may, Lara Diamond, who's a wonderful Maryland-based genealogist and a leading light in the Jewish genealogy world, got a cousin match to somebody. And when they started comparing notes, she realized that her grandfather had an aunt that their family tree had marked killed in the Holocaust. And it turned out she was just in Detroit. So there are wonderful discoveries like this that can be made through DNA. I think I told you the last time we spoke, I just had an unbelievable experience of using DNA to identify a woman who was found as an orphan after the Holocaust she was a toddler and had no idea where she had come from or how she had gotten to this orphanage. She lived her entire life. Unfortunately, she passed away, never knowing who she was or where she came from. But she did DNA tests before she died. And working with a wonderful partner, I was able, over the course of a year, very unlike the 45 minutes that I spent with Danny, to use her DNA results to find her family. And her daughter was just reunited with her aunts and her first cousins last month. And it was unbelievable. And there was no way we could have done that. I mean, no one knew anything about where she had come from, but her DNA told us where she had come from. So
interesting. But Danny, here's one for you. Can you speak to why you think parents keep these secrets? Is it changing generationally, culturally? I found out as an adult also, this woman is writing that I was donor conceived and relate to this experience of being a secret in my own family.
I think it boils down to shame and feeling threatened, being afraid that by telling the truth, that parental bond might somehow be shaken, that there might be some surly 14-year-old at some point saying, you're not really my father, or you're not really my mother, which, 14-year-olds say all sorts of awful things. In my parents' generation, it was meant to be a secret that everyone would take to the grave with them. It was underscored that the child must never know. I think today that has changed tremendously, although I will say in all the traveling I did on my book tour, I did encounter quite a lot of people who, there were a whole gradation, there were gradations. I encountered a lot of couples who had grown kids who were now, they read inheritance, and then suddenly they thought, oh my, do we need to sit down with our grown children and tell them the truth? Because they read my book and realized that if they didn't, the chances are that their children were going to find out at some point. And perhaps when they were no longer here to be able to do perhaps the last great act of parenting that they might be able to do. I think it came out of that, but now there are, as Jennifer said, support groups everywhere. There's a world of children who are being born to knowing that they're donor conceived, whether it's egg donors or sperm donors, and there are sort of worlds in which these children can encounter their half siblings. But even today, I mean, not to throw like a Molotov cocktail into this whole thing, but even today, there are still lots of parents in my anecdotal experience who are still choosing to not tell their children. And when people come to me and ask me what to do about that, and I've had therapists also come to me to say, what do I tell my patients, or what do I tell parents who are deciding not to tell their children, or saying, well, we're on the fence, we may tell them someday. And the only answer I can give that is, it's got nothing to do with being, judgmental or moralistic or even the ethics of it, is simply, your children are going to find out. They're going to find out. So the question now is really only, we go back to what Libby said at the beginning. We're kind of at the end of the era of the secret, and that's a very complex place to be as a society. Ultimately, I think it's in this regard, in any event, a good thing.
There are several questions that speak to the, just intense popularity, particularly in America. So I really have the question, like, why only Americans? I mean, not only Americans, but clearly Americans seem more interested in this. And just in general, why is this, fascination so intense? Is it the aging baby boomers, somebody's asking, or simply the availability of tests now? Or there's something else going on that's propelling this search, these seekers, as you call them, Libby?
Yeah. I think, well, first of all, you have this kind of tradition of people coming here and assimilating themselves out of ethnic identities, right? The religions, the customs, the foods, the language of the past, at least in decades past, was very much something that you threw over in favor of making Jell-O molds. And so, that we happen to find ourselves now in a moment where people are suddenly waking up and saying, wait a minute, what was my grandfather? And you can trace this to a number of forces. If you look at the history of genealogy in the US, it kind of ebbs and flows. And I've written a little bit about this. I have a column on Psychology Today. And one of the things that I explore is sort of like, why genealogy, why now, and how did we get to this place? So if you look at the second half of the 20th century, you start to see a rise in multicultural awareness. So different groups, not just, Mayflower descendants, not just daughters of the American Revolution, but wait a minute, like, where did my people come from in Africa? Or, what were my grandparents? I don't know. And then you see sort of the rise of, the internet and, personal computers and subscription services. And then finally DNA. And I think, particularly in the US, where, we have shows like on PBS, like Henry Louis Gates's wonderful show, Finding Your Roots. We have this great curiosity about we want to watch and see what celebrities are going to find out about their, their hidden ancestral stories. And there's very much a sense of reclamation, of desiring maybe some sense of authenticity that comes from being able to look at your past. Whether you're basically an American mutt like me, someone with a pie chart that's like got all sorts of little pieces cut out, or you're somebody who has deep roots somewhere, but you never really had access to it. So, and I think in addition to that, if you look at other places in Europe, for instance, a lot of times people know where they're from. They're like, I'm from here. Right. And they may grow up in a more homogenous society, and they may be more rooted in place. So they don't have that kind of seeking, I feel like we're all now coming a nation of seekers, defining ourselves through the past. They already kind of know where they come from because they maybe never moved. And then on top of that, in places like Germany, for instance, I have heard anecdotally, there are some people who feel like, finding out a pie chart that allows you to kind of parse genetic difference is absolutely the opposite of what I want to be doing here. So there may be kind of cultural and regulatory reasons in addition to, the kind of pull and the lure among Americans to test.
Libby, several people are asking if you've done it. Have you?
I've done it in three different places.
Okay.
And the first time I tested was because I got it as a gift, which is how a lot of people get it. And we were able to make some pretty amazing discoveries along both my maternal and paternal lines. I had kind of the experience that you want to have if you see the ad, or the many ads. So along my dad's side, we were able to find my dad's second cousin in Sweden. And right before the pandemic started, just a few months before, we were able to travel to Sweden and meet her and see where my dad's grandmother had come from. Literally the foundation of her farmhouse, literally the church where she worshiped and the school that she attended. Mm-hmm. And on my mother's side, I'm Ashkenazi Jewish. And we were able to find, this is pretty amazing, her second cousin. And that's from a line of people who survived in Ukraine. And we did not know they existed because my mom's forebear came over and never spoke again of the folks that he had left behind. But this was a branch that survived through pogroms, through World War II and all of its horrors, and through the USSR, and then went to Israel and came to New York. Boom. And again, paper records are amazing. And genealogists will say, if you're doing DNA, you combine it with genealogy, right? It's not DNA alone is not going to get you anywhere. You've got to use the records too. But there are some things that you could simply never find without DNA. And my story, those discoveries on both sides are in fact things people we would not have known existed if not for that technology.
I say that DNA is the fast pass at Disney. It gets you right to the front of the line. There are many situations where DNA has found people for me where I'm not exaggerating. I could have spent the rest of my waking days on Earth trying to find these people. And it's only because of a DNA match that I was able to track them down. It's just extraordinary. It's kind of miraculous because, in my case, my great-grandmother's maiden name was Fleischman, and that's a pretty common name, and we knew nothing. And there was no paper records on her at all. She defied genealogical, representation. And I got a DNA match and it completely busted open the entire Fleischman branch of, I got pictures of her sister and brother that we never knew she had. And, and I always say I could have spent every day for the rest of my life calling every Fleischman family in the US trying to find these people. But I had a DNA match to a Fleischman, and that's how you do it. So it can be pretty extraordinary.
Several people are asking why it just says European Jewish or Ashkenazi, that you don't get a little bit more specificity sometimes.
The way I like to explain it is to think of the way that your DNA can tell you that your people come from, Sweden or Peru or, Togo. What are those places? They're countries, right? And what is a country? It's a place that's tied together by a language and customs. So you need to think of your Jewishness as sort of your country, at least with Ashkenazi Jewishness. And I always try to make very clear, I do not do any Sephardic work. There are other people who I just don't have any expertise with Sephardic, either DNA or paper records. I do strictly Ashkenazi. So unfortunately, your DNA cannot, some people, I always try to caution people, some Ashkenazi Jews think they're going to take the test and it's going to tell them, what shtetl their great-grandparents came from. And unfortunately, again, if you think of Jewishness as your country, it's just going to tell you that's the country you come from. It cannot tell you that you are a Polish Jew or a Romanian Jew or a Galicianer. Ancestry has some geographic communities where it can sort of hone in a little closer, but it is absolutely not a substitute for doing the paper research that will tell you where these people came from. And the one thing I love more than anything to proselytize about is that is actually a lot less difficult than most people believe it is. There is this widespread myth that the Germans destroyed all the records in World War II, or the pogroms destroyed all the records and there are no records. Like, I could hop on my computer right now and pull up the birth record of my third great grandfather in Latvia. Like, these things are online. They're not for every community, but much more is out there than people realize. So as Libby said earlier, I preach a combination. You have to do your paper trail research and DNA testing, and they sort of work hand in hand, because as I always tell people, the better fleshed out your paper tree, the more you can identify your distant cousins. Meaning, if you don't know who your second great grandparents are, you won't recognize your third cousin matches because they won't be familiar to you. So, and if you get good DNA matches, they can help you blow out your paper tree. So if you do both, you have the best chance for getting what most people want, which is, a really exciting fleshed out tree with all sorts of cool connections and stories and cousins that you never knew about. And, that's what most people want. So, but again, I think if everything we've talked about for the last hour makes clear, if you are not prepared to take that risk that when you spit in that tube, you are not going to get the result that you were expecting, you shouldn't do it, because that is a very real possibility.
There are several questions related to nature versus nurture, which you all referred to in some way too, but this one particularly is connected to that. And Danny, it's for you. How did Danny's discovery impact her religious identity? Did she become more or less invested in her Jewish upbringing?
I'm so glad I get to answer that with this audience. When early on, when I first made my discovery, I had so many well-meaning people say to me, well, you're Jewish because, Jewish mother, Jewish egg, no question about that. Your son is Jewish. That couldn't have mattered to me less, because psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, my sense of my Jewishness actually really came from my dad, and still does. I spent 54 years, 23 with him, and then the remainder without him, steeped in my Jewishness, and discovering that genetically I'm half Jewish, if anything, made me feel more Jewish. It's hard to even unpack that, but what it did was make me understand why people felt constantly moved to tell me that I didn't look Jewish, why there was this kind of feeling of things not adding up. I finally just was able to let it all go and just be this kind of hybrid mongrel person that it took 3 people to make. The dad who, loved me into being, the biological father who I certainly have inherited some of my nature from, and my mother who raised me and who is my biological mother, but who I really wasn't that close to. I was much closer to my dad. So I actually feel now like there's a stronger ground to stand on as a Jew. I wasn't religious. I mean, I was raised Orthodox, but I wasn't practicing before, and I'm actually, if anything, practicing more now. I've been going to Shabbat services via Zoom during the pandemic. So, if anything, it's really made me feel more deeply connected again, because as I said before, I feel like I have just a much greater clarity about what the truth of my identity is.
Well, we've gone over a little bit. I don't want to keep you too long. I'm just going to ask you all to comment kind of in a final way, both either on the nature-nurture issue and also in terms of, with so much information that you have in discovery and research, what do you think needs to change in terms of the field and how it's moving so rapidly?
So
because
I love what Danny had to say, and I kind of just wanted to piggyback on that. I think biology is not identity alone, right? But it certainly informs it. And what I found over and over as I interviewed people who discovered, Alice in my book, who discovered she's Jewish, a man named Rosario, who I interviewed, who discovered he was part sub-Saharan African. He had been told he was Sicilian. And discovered this in the middle of his life, that it's not as if we identify ourselves with the precision of a pie chart, right? We don't go around thinking I am 18% this and 60% that. I myself am half Ashkenazi Jewish, but I identify as Jewish. And there are complicated reasons, and that great Hadassah article that ran, it's kind of gets into this question of why we identify more strongly with certain ethnicities. But I think, for the countless Americans who are now rediscovering some facet of their past, some branch they didn't know about, something that informs their identity now, the response tends to be, not so much binary, but yes, and I will take this and I will take that. And very much is dependent on the circumstances behind why you didn't know. If it's something that you don't connect with, it might not be something that you kind of claim. If it's something that was kept from you because of an accident of fate, or because of the cruelties of history, or because of the shame of a secret, it might be something that is so much more meaningful to you, right? Than if the circumstances are different. So that's sort of one piece. I think I would just, it's kind of a bid for nuance. For us to think about love and family relationships and ethnicity with not a nature versus nurture mindset, but with a both mindset. I think that's how we're going to kind of get ourselves in the best possible position, given everything that's happening right now, with as much kind of expansiveness and generosity as we can bring.
Yeah, I'd love to piggyback on that, because what Libby just said about verses, I've heard that so much on my travels, and I found myself thinking, okay, why are people so threatened in a way by the idea of nature at all? Like, let's just eradicate nature and make it all nurture, shall we? And that would be great, except that we can't. But I found myself thinking, why are we wanting to do that? And what I've come to in my thinking thus far is that we want to do that because we believe that nurture is something that we can control. If we raise our children in a certain way and we instill our values, and then we educate them, we raise them in places and in ways that are going to, as we see it, enrich them, then we are in some way or another assuring their maturing in a certain way. And as anyone who's listening to this who has more than one child knows, you have multiple children, being raised in the same environment with the same parents and the same DNA. And what you actually have are different natures. We can't control nature, so we're a little bit afraid of it. But to be afraid of it is, that's fine, but we can't deny its existence. I'm the embodiment of that. I am the product of nature, of nurture. I'm the product of my father's love that I really believe is like why I'm even sitting here, why I survived my childhood. I'm the product of my mother. And I'm also the product of a 22-year-old anonymous sperm donor who had certain qualities that became part of my constitution. All of that is the case. So it's nature and nurture. And the verses is, I think, where we get into some of the stickier territory.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.